Hello, this is Mr. Smith, also known as Teach Smith on YouTube. This is comparing Power and Conflict poems, building on week 1, the week commencing the 8th of June 2020. This is primarily for Year 10 students at Reigate School, though of course other students are welcome to watch. So first of all, let's start with our Inspectacles, Recap and Spag starter. As always, you can rewrite the whole paragraph, or when you find a mistake, write down the individual word or phrase correctly. Age is an important theme in an Inspectacles. Priestley uses it to show how he believed that there was hope in the younger generation's ability to learn and change. The older characters' opinions and behaviours are stubbornly fixed. So please pause the video and make the corrections. So as you can see, always, all three words and an Inspectacles should have capitals. Priestley, don't forget that second E. Believed is a tricky one, make sure you spell that correctly. And the correct use of apostrophes, generation, apostrophe before the S, characters, because it's plural, apostrophe after the S. And then stubbornly, 2 B's for stubbornly. Now to the main topic of this video. So remember, we are teaching this poetry anthology as a collection of poems. It's about understanding the poems as a cluster, as groups, grouped by theme. It would be much easier to do your comparison essay and to revise the poems in this way. As a result of this, we're going to look at the poem London today and look how it compares to My Last Duchess and Ozymandias, the two poems we looked at and compared last week. So I'm just going to briefly reread the poem. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Remember, this poem will actually be all the way down, all 4 stanzas. However, it just looks better this way, side by side on the screen. You will get a question very much like this. Remember, in this format, compare how poets present ideas about power in London and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. So in order to prepare for this question, a quick recap about London. So the main message of the poem. Blake is criticising the abuse of power. Power from different sources. Power from the government, power from the monarchy, and power from the church. I'll come on to context in a moment, but it's very important to understand that Blake had a very, very strong faith, but did not agree with organised religion. Blake is also portraying the awful effects of poverty and oppression on the ordinary people of London. What do I mean by oppression? So oppression is where people feel like they are powerless, when they feel like they're strictly controlled, often with violence or the threat of violence. They don't feel like they're in control of their own lives. So some further context on William Blake. Blake lived in London almost all his life. London was very rapidly growing due to the Industrial Revolution. It couldn't really cope with the level of growth. It was extremely overcrowded, squalid, dirty, smoggy, sooty from all the new factories. It was a really overcrowded and quite desperate place for many areas of London at that time. I've put the word romantic in italics and in speech marks. It's very important to understand Blake wasn't a romantic in terms of, he wouldn't have called himself that, and he wasn't part of some romantic tradition that came later. However, you could say he was almost a grandfather of the romantic movement, or he had the seeds of the romantic movement in terms of he hated the artificial, he hated industrialization, he hated how the city had turned out to be so populated, overcrowded, and he preferred and embraced, preferred is too weak a word, embraced and advocated for the natural world, the mystical world particularly. Blake was alive for both the French and American revolutions, so very much a tumultuous time, a time of great change, both good and bad, in terms of the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Finally, it's very, very important to understand that London is part of a wider collection of poems called the Songs of Experience, which itself is the kind of dark counterpart to a group of poems called the Songs of Innocence. Why is it important to know this? Because London is part of a collection of poems where Blake sees humanity let down, or humanity corrupted, or humanity forgotten in pursuit of other things, humanity crushed. He often uses how children were exploited in this time as an example of this. For example, the chimney sweepers, how young, bright, innocent children were destroyed and quite literally in some cases crushed by the jobs they had to do as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So, which poem or poems could you compare London to? I've already given you the answer, so I hope you were listening, and please write them down. The two poems are Ozymandias and My Last Duchess. It's very important to see them as a cluster. Of course, these poems can be compared in other ways, and we will look at that in the coming weeks. However, it's just a way of building upon previous knowledge and understanding them as a group. So think about why I say this. Why would London compare with Ozymandias and My Last Duchess? So we're going to start with My Last Duchess. Remember the main messages of the poem. Browning is criticising the abuse of power by the Duke, and Browning is criticising gender inequality. You could argue that Blake is criticising gender inequality and inequality in general. So I have again thought of three arguments. Again, start with the arguments. Start with the AO1, your ideas. So the abuse of power. Both poets are critical of society at the time. And then I've added a new point, which is quite tricky, but I just wanted you to hear it and have a go. So power and oppression seems inescapable. It seems like an endless cycle. It seems like it will go on forever. It's a very negative ending to the poem. That I've given away a little bit there, but a very negative feel to the poem. So I want you to look at London, think about how you could find a quotation about the abuse of power, find a quotation about the poet being critical of society at the time. Concentrate on those first 2 points, the abuse of power and being critical of society, being critical of how London was at that time. If you're able to find something about London's power and abuse of power seeming to be inescapable or an endless loop, or it will never end, try and find that as well. So please pause the video and look for these key quotations. So there's several quotations about the abuse of power. I've put, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls, about the monarchy, the palace sending off soldiers to die. The poet critical of society at the time, probably the most famous quotation from this poem. In every voice and every ban, the mind-forged manacles are here. So remember, this is about how people felt oppressed, people felt limited, marginalised, powerless, no freedom, no imagination, and Blake was devastated by this because he felt human beings should be free, imaginative, playful, creative, and people in London seem to be none of those things. And then power and oppression seems inescapable. The more tricky part I've put, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So just as life begins, it seems to be ruined again. So in this case, newly married couples, the man most typically would have some kind of venereal disease, which would cause problems in the marriage, or perhaps marriage itself is too strict an institution and people should be freer. It could also mean that marriage is kind of just a way of giving up on life and will just end up with, going through the motions until death. Blake had some quite radical ideas, but essentially forms of control seem never ending, and the results of the abuse of power seem to add to more and more and more corruption because of prostitution leading to the spread of disease. So now think back to My Last Duchess. Hopefully you'll be able to remember the quotations for abuse of power and the poet being critical of society at the time. So I gave commands and all smiles stopped together. That moment where it strongly implied that the Duchess was killed. The poet was critical of society at the time. The dramatic monologue, power only in the hands of wealthy men. The enjambment showing a dangerously impulsive man. And then the cycle of power and oppression. I just found an interesting quotation here at the end. I just want you to look at where the lines fall. We'll meet the company below then. I repeat. The Duke is talking about the next young woman he's going to marry, and it just feels like the process is going to repeat again, which is heavily suggested in the words I repeat. So Ozymandias then, the main messages of the poem, again the abuse of power and satirizing arrogant rulers. Now I don't want you to go through the whole process again, so I've just shown you how a similar process can happen with London and Ozymandias. Interestingly, if I just move to power and oppression seems inescapable, the lone and level sands stretch far away, I just had a thought that no one can escape the power of nature, not even Ozymandias himself. So for all his pomp and circumstance, he will be destroyed by the power of nature. I just thought that was an interesting argument you could make, perhaps for a higher level. Just take a moment to look at those comparisons. Remember, if there's any questions you have about these videos, please message me on Show My Homework, or if you're another student watching this, you can make a comment on YouTube. Now, I wanted to show you something interesting. All of the section in bold and italics is the same, exactly the same, as the comparison paragraph I wrote last week. I'm just trying to show you how you can build on sort of webs of knowledge, clusters of knowledge, so you can use similar, if not the same, arguments in different essays. Of course, if you were talking about conflict or nature, these specific arguments would not work. It's so important to not just copy and paste across everything. However, like I said, there are small clusters of poems which can use same or similar points. And I think that's the way to deal effectively with the fact that there are 15 poems. So I'll just give you a moment to read that paragraph. You may also want to pause the video. Year 10, I hope this video was helpful, this recorded lesson was helpful. Again, please do ask me questions or Show My Homework, ask for help, and there will be more videos and tasks throughout the week to help you understand this comparison or these comparisons. Thank you very much for watching.